How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're going to be checking out another one by history mapped out. We have 100 Years of War, England versus France. So this one's another suggested video from First Doublet. So shout out to you. You know who you are. You're somewhere over in France right now waiting for this video to drop. So we're going to check it out. History mapped out. Hit like, hit subscribe, do all that super fun, awesome stuff. And we're going to do some learning today.
In 1328, the Capetian royal dynasty, which had ruled France for over 3 centuries, ceased to exist. The kingdom faced difficult times, as an empty throne could lead to civil war. To prevent this, Philip, Duke of Valois, convened the most powerful feudal lords of France. Since the House of Valois itself was descended from the Capetian line, Philip proposed himself as a candidate for the throne. The majority supported him, and he was soon crowned in Reims as King Philip VI.
Reims? I've never heard of Reims. Is that something that... I don't know a lot about France, but I know Paris and stuff, obviously, is the famous city. I just assumed they would have done something like that in Paris. But then, you know, that's what I get for assuming.
Apart from Philip, several other feudal lords laid claim to the crown, notably King Edward III of England, who had French ancestry through his mother Isabella of France. However, the French aristocracy did not want to be ruled by a foreign king, and thus rejected Edward's claim. Consequently, Edward returned to England and began preparations for war. Philip VI also prepared for war. He consolidated his power, suppressed uprisings in Flanders, and formed an alliance with Scotland. Then he decided to take Gascony from Edward III, the only English-held land on the continent from which they could launch attacks on France. In 1337, Philip VI found a pretext and declared the confiscation of Gascony. In response, Edward III declared war on France. Within 2 years, the English assembled an army and landed in Flanders. Edward III had long-standing allies there, and Flanders quickly sided with the English. For an entire year, the English looted Picardy. Only the news that Philip VI, with an army, had arrived near Amiens forced them to retreat. Despite this, Edward decided not to abandon the war, and in 1340 proclaimed himself King of France. The conflict escalated from a skirmish over Gascony to a...
That's what he claimed in England. He's like, all right, guys, I'm the king of France now. People in France are like, what's this guy talking about? We don't want him to be our king. We don't want somebody from a foreign land to rule our country.
Full-blown war for the French crown. In response, Philip VI sent his fleet to Flanders to prevent the English from returning. However, in the Battle of Slez, the English easily defeated this fleet and once again landed in Flanders.
Okay.
A year later, war broke out in Brittany, where one of the claimants to the ducal title, John of Montfort, supported the English. This gave England the opportunity to attack France from 3 directions. Only then did the French realize the seriousness of the situation. In 1345, the French Prince John set out to conquer Gascony. He nearly succeeded, but the defeat at Auberoche nullified all French gains. In 1346, Edward III landed in Cotentin and moved inland, pillaging lands along his way. The French king left the capital and gathered his troops in Rouen, expecting the English to head there. However, Edward marched towards Paris. Lacking the strength to capture the city, the English merely looted the surrounding lands before heading towards Flanders. The French followed them. The armies finally met in Picardy near Crécy. The French had a significant numerical advantage, with more cavalry and additional reinforcements from Italian mercenaries. The English, however, could counter this only with their disciplined forces and the famed English longbowmen. The first French attack was launched before half of their troops had even reached the battlefield. Each feudal lord led his contingent separately, resulting in disorganized assaults. The French cavalry trampled their crossbowmen due to the lack of coordination. Meanwhile, the English longbowmen continuously rained arrows upon the advancing French forces, and when the enemy got too close, they were driven back by the English knights. The French attempted.
Was this all wrote down in detail? Like, how do they know that this is what happened in this step, and this person, they shot arrows, and then they, you know what I mean? Like, did they write down all the details? Or are they just speculating that that's probably what happened during that battle? I mean, you know, it was so long ago.
The enemy got too close, they were driven back by the English knights. The French attempted to engage in battle multiple times, conducting a total of 17 attacks, but all ended the same way. That night, Philip VI realized the heavy losses he had suffered and decided to retreat, leaving a third of his army on the battlefield. After defeating the French, Edward III decided to consolidate his continental holdings. He began the siege of Calais, which lasted a year. This gave the French enough time to gather a new army. However, Philip VI, mindful of the previous defeat, did not dare to engage in another battle and ceded the strategic city to the English. Soon after, both sides agreed to a truce, and Edward III returned to England.
Okay.
In 1350, Prince John became King John II the Good. He aimed to finally defeat the English and reclaim the lost territories. However, Edward III preempted him by deliberately making impossible demands during negotiations. And after the French king's refusal, he declared the truce null and void. In 1355, two English armies landed on the continent. One, commanded by Edward III, landed in Calais. The other, led by his son, also named Edward and later known as the Black Prince, with 7,000 soldiers, landed in Gascony. The Black Prince immediately embarked on a plundering campaign in Occitania, and the following year he raided Aquitaine. In response, John II assembled a significant army and headed south. He encountered the Black Prince at Poitiers, where the French army repeated almost all the mistakes from the Battle of Crécy. The French suffered heavy losses on the battlefield, and King John II was captured. The English had not anticipated such success. They quickly concluded a truce in Bordeaux and agreed to return the French king in exchange for a large ransom.
They're like, we didn't realize we were going to do that good. We surprised ourselves.
French Prince Charles was ready to pay this money for his
He's got a good name, Charles.
father, but the Parisians opposed the idea and rose in rebellion, demanding that such resources be used to continue the war. The prince had to flee to Reims. At the same time, Charles II of Navarre, who also claimed the French crown, distinguished himself in France. He chose the path of intrigue and deception, earning the nickname Charles the Bad. Taking advantage of the absence of both the king and the prince from the capital, he forged an alliance with the English and began gathering an army, aiming to capture Paris and proclaim himself king. But in 1358, a peasant uprising erupted in northern France. The peasants were discontented with the prolonged war, rampant banditry, and the government's inaction. This uprising became known as the Jacquerie. It was in this context that Charles the Bad decided to make his move. Pretending to be an ally of the rebellious peasants, he attacked them during negotiations, massacring them with exceptional brutality. However, this did not increase support for Charles the Bad. Although the Parisians let him into the city, they quickly revolted against him, recalling both his friendship with the English and his cruelty in suppressing the Jacquerie. Faced with this opposition, Charles the Bad renounced his claims to the crown in front of Prince Charles, but in return received lands in Normandy. Understanding the tragic situation in France, John II, who was then in London, signed a peace treaty with Edward III. According to this treaty, the English king renounced his claims to the French throne, but received half of France in return. However, the French did not agree with such a treaty, and
Okay, that's why yeah, I was gonna say, dang, I didn't think that happened. Like that would have been a different outcome today. But I guess the French dude was like, nah, dude. No, we can't be having that.
The Parisians even allowed Prince Charles to return to the capital. There, he officially declared that he did not recognize the treaty signed by his father. Then, Edward III quickly gathered an army and marched to Rheims.
So his dad, so hold on, John the Good did sign it? And Prince Charles was the one that was like, nah, dude, no. Is that what? I'm gonna have to hear this again, guys. We gotta get some clarification here.
Who was then in London, signed a peace treaty with Edward III.
He did sign it.
According to this treaty, the English king renounced his claims to the French throne, but received half of France in return. However, the French did not agree with such a treaty, and the Parisians even allowed Prince Charles to return to the capital. There, he officially declared that he did not recognize the treaty signed by his father.
Yeah, he's like, no, that's
Then,
junk.
Edward III quickly gathered an army and marched to Rheims. However, this campaign turned out to be a failure for the English. They failed to capture any significant city and suffered heavy losses when winter arrived. In 1360, the Treaty of Brittany was signed. Aquitaine was ceded to England, and John II returned home. But he promised to pay a substantial ransom. Nevertheless, this peace treaty did not bring an end to the war. In 1362, John II, having failed to pay the ransom, voluntarily returned to captivity in England.
What?
2 years later, he died there. His son, now Charles V the Wise, began preparations for war. He implemented military reforms.
Wonder why, if he got the name Wise, because, like, everybody else was just making dumb decisions, it seemed like. So they're like, well, this guy, he's real wise, because you got Charles the Good, Charles the Bad. Well, we got to come up with another nickname for this guy. Oh, Wise. There you go.
He centralized command, increased the number of mercenaries, and created units of French archers. Additionally, he appointed talented military leaders to high positions, one of whom, Bertrand de Guesclin, was given the post of Constable of France, effectively the commander of all the kingdom's forces. Meanwhile, Charles the Bad was once again plotting to seize Paris and become King of France.
Sure he was.
However, in 1364, Bertrand de Guesclin marched against the Navarrese and swiftly captured all of Charles the Bad's possessions in Normandy. Soon after, he caught up with and defeated his forces in the Battle of Cockerel. Following this defeat, Charles the Bad abandoned his attempts at war with the French king for a long time. The following year, de Guesclin attempted to reclaim the Duchy of Brittany. However, he faced defeat at the Battle of Auray, and Duke de Montfort expanded his holdings. France had many retired soldiers who had nothing to occupy themselves with, and thus turned to looting. King Charles V hired some of them for military service, but many who did not join the army continued their brigandage. The king devised a clever plan to rid himself of these marauders. He intervened in the Castilian Civil War, gathered 15,000 mercenaries under de Guesclin's command, and sent them to support his ally, Henry II of Trastamara.
Trastamara, huh? So this is obviously where Spain is nowadays. But at the time, I think there was a lot of Arabs from Northern Africa, Morocco, kind of, you know, Middle East, that came up. And that's what a lot of the nationality can be traced to, actually. A small percentage, at least, in Spain. That's why they have a little bit of a darker skin than a lot of the rest of the people in Europe.
Guesclin easily defeated the Castilian king Peter I the Cruel, who fled to the English. Peter then allied with Edward the Black Prince and returned to Castile with 8,000 mercenaries. The armies met at the Battle of Nájera. Taking advantage of Henry II's misfortune, Peter the Cruel and the Black Prince's forces defeated the Franco-Spanish troops and captured Bertrand de Guesclin. However, after the victory, Peter I did not pay his soldiers and failed to grant the promised lands to the Black Prince. Edward abandoned the Castilian king, which soon ended Peter the Cruel's reign. In Spain, the Black Prince contracted dysentery. Upon returning to Aquitaine, he
It's okay.
Also quarreled with his vassals. This forced him to seek mediation from the French king in his disputes with the feudal lords. Charles V seized this opportunity and began the conquest of Aquitaine. The 100 Years' War reignited with renewed intensity. The English, under the command of Captain Robert Knowles, landed in Calais and attempted to seize Picardy. However, they faced significant resistance from the French. Bertrand de Guesclin skillfully stretched the English forces through maneuvers, winning small battles. After a year, the English suffered too many losses to continue the campaign and retreated to Aquitaine. But de Guesclin pursued and defeated them at the Battle of Pont-Vilaine. De Guesclin then moved towards Aquitaine, capturing cities along the way, and in 1372 took La Rochelle. The following year, a rebellion broke out in Brittany. John of Montfort was forced to flee to England, and de Guesclin took the opportunity to seize the peninsula without a fight. Returning to Aquitaine, de Guesclin defeated the English at the Battle of Chizay. Within a year, the French had liberated most of Aquitaine, leaving the English with only the county of Gascony. These French successes were large.
And that's the first one they had anyways, so it just set it back to the way it was, kind of like a full circle.
Largely due to the condition of Edward the Black Prince, who, due to illness, returned to England for treatment in 1371 and soon died.
I guess they still have Calais right there by Flanders, but...
A year later, his father, King Edward III, also passed away.
Jeez.
The new King of England was Richard II, the son of the Black Prince. Unlike his illustrious father, Richard II had a weak character and was dependent on the nobility. England now faced the threat of civil war. In 1380, the French crossed the English Channel and pillaged Kent. The following year, a peasant revolt broke out in England. In 1384, the Burgundian acquired Flanders through marriage, removing one of England's wealthiest continental allies. This situation led to a catastrophe in England, and Henry, Duke of Lancaster, who bore personal grudges against Richard II, staged a coup and became King Henry IV. France was in no better condition. In 1380, both King Charles V the Wise and Constable Bertrand de Guesclin died. The new king, Charles VI the Mad, saw Paris embroiled in noble intrigues for control of the kingdom. Soon, all of France was caught in a struggle between the Dukes of Burgundy and the Dukes of Orleans, which eventually escalated into a full-blown civil war, known as the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. Meanwhile, Henry V, only the second king of England from the Lancastrian dynasty, sought to bolster his authority through military victories. The situation in France only made this easier. Citing the French support of a Welsh rebellion 10 years earlier as a pretext, Henry...
A French support of a Welsh rebellion. So Wales was trying to rebel and remain independent from England. France... So this is how Wales started too? I was actually literally always wondering, like, what's up with Wales? Why is it just this little small little spot right there? It's pretty much England. I mean, it's not, but it, you know.
Citing the French support of a Welsh rebellion 10 years earlier as a pretext, Henry V declared war, and in 1415 landed in Normandy with an army, then moved towards Calais for reinforcements. The French army, under Constable Charles d'Albret, moved to intercept him. At the Battle of Agincourt, the French army once again displayed a lack of discipline and suffered a devastating defeat, losing a third of their soldiers.
A lot of death.
The Battle of Agincourt proved to be an even greater disaster for the French than all previous defeats in the 100 Years' War. The French army, which was supposed to defend the kingdom, simply disappeared. By 1419, the English had captured Normandy, Brittany, and Maine, and laid siege to the capital. Soon, the Burgundians, aggrieved by the dishonorable murder of their duke, sided with the English. Consequently, in 1420, Charles VI was forced to sign the Treaty of Troyes, according to which, upon his death, the French crown would pass to the English King Henry V. For this to happen, Henry V had to marry the French princess Catherine of Valois, a union that would later play a cruel trick on the Lancastrian dynasty. In 1421, the French Prince Charles gathered his own army from among Scottish and Italian mercenaries.
I wonder how it would be a trick. Oh, because would that also give her the rights to England in some way, or that it would carry into her family's line? So then France would be like, well, you guys keep trying to get ties to England, and, you know, we're going to flip-flop it around. Huh.
Prince Charles gathered his own army from among Scottish and Italian mercenaries. Unwilling to accept that he would not inherit the crown upon his father's death, he planned to defeat the English. He faced off against the English king's brother, Duke Thomas of Lancaster. In the Battle of Beaujeu, the English were caught in an ambush and defeated, with Thomas being killed. In 1422, both Charles VI and Henry V died. The English immediately demanded that the French crown be handed over to the young Henry VI. Meanwhile, another brother of the English king, Duke John of Lancaster, captured Champagne. More importantly, he seized the city of Reims, where French kings were traditionally crowned.
Okay.
Simultaneously, French nobles gathered in Poitiers and refused to recognize the English Henry VI as their king, offering the crown instead to Prince Charles. Prince Charles hoped to reclaim Normandy, but suffered a defeat at the Battle of Verneuil, narrowly escaping the battlefield. He then began forming a new army, notably reconciling with the Bretons, which required him to recognize John de Montfort as the rightful Duke of Brittany. With the support of Breton troops, Prince Charles recaptured Chinon. In response, the English laid siege to Orleans, hoping to open the road to southern France. However, thanks to the heroism of the French, the siege of Orleans dragged on for a year. During this time, Joan of Arc arrived in Chinon to...
We're learning about Joan of Arc soon too, guys. We have another video on the to-do list about Joan of Arc, so stay tuned for that. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on it after you subscribe and hit like, of course.
Meet Charles. She claimed that God had sent her to save France from the English and asked for troops. Various theories about Joan of Arc's origins exist, ranging from her being a simple peasant girl to being the illegitimate daughter of King Charles VI. Receiving a small contingent of knights from Prince Charles, Joan of Arc set out to lift the siege of Orleans. The campaign became known as the Loire Campaign. Joan participated directly in the battles, even suffering wounds, but managed to defeat the English outside the walls of Orleans and recapture all surrounding fortresses. She triumphantly entered the liberated Orleans and, not giving the English time to recover, pursued and defeated them again at Patay.
Nice.
Thus, she freed the Loire Valley. These victories boosted French morale, and Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, was given command of a larger force and set out to liberate Reims. The inhabitants of Champagne surrendered their lands without a fight. The French prince, now Charles VII, arrived in Reims for his coronation, earning the title the Victorious. Joan of Arc aimed to liberate the French capital. She laid siege to Paris, but...
So does that mean technically Paris was English at one point? Like Paris was an English city? Because it was an English rule, English territory? Interesting, guys. Interesting.
The English and their Burgundian allies had left a strong garrison there, and the siege failed. Joan was wounded for the second time.
Uh-oh.
Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Compiègne rose against the English, but the city was besieged by the Burgundians. Joan of Arc, without waiting for reinforcements, went to aid the people of Compiègne, but lost the battle and was captured. Later, the English tried her for witchcraft and burned her at the stake in Rouen. Despite this, Joan of Arc became a heroine of France.
So, why'd they say she was a witch? Is it because she was so good at defeating them? They're like, oh, there's no way that anybody could be that good at defeating us. She must be a witch.
After the death of the Maid of Orleans, the French did not stop the war. Charles VII conducted military reforms, creating a professional army of mercenaries and adopting new technology, firearms. During this time, the French organized many uprisings in the occupied territories. The uprisings in Picardy in 1431 could not be suppressed.
Firearms, huh? 14. I guess I didn't realize that they had them that long ago. I mean, you're just right after the medieval times here. Now you're talking about firearms? I mean, of course, they're not accurate and they take 20 hours to load. But it's still a firearm, right? I didn't know. I thought it was like 1600s, I thought was the firearm times, but we're talking 1400s.
The English, led by Duke John of Lancaster, lost the Battle of Saint-Denis. However, the uprising in Rouen was brutally suppressed. In 1435, the French defeated the English at the Battle of Gerberoy and liberated part of the French lands. That same year, Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy, alarmed by French successes in the war, returned Burgundy to the French crown. As a gesture of goodwill, he freed Flanders, but after suffering a defeat at Calais, he left the city under English control. In 1449, Charles VII organized a campaign to Normandy. He defeated the English at the Battle of Formigny, after which the inhabitants of Rouen, who despised the English, opened the city gates to the French. 2 years later, Charles VII moved south and easily captured Bordeaux. However, the following year, the English, led by Baron Talbot, retook the city. In 1450,
They've had that spot for a while, it seems. It's Gascony or Gasco. Yeah, something Gascony, I think.
53, Charles VII returned to Gascony with an army and defeated the English at the Battle of Castellon. The French artillery played a crucial role in this battle, marking the beginning of a new era in military history, according to many scholars. Although the last English-held city, Calais, was not recaptured by the French until 100 years later, the victory at Castellon is considered the end of the 100 Years' War.
But there was still that one little city, though. But they weren't at war, I guess. It was just like, you can have it, whatever. We're done fighting.
The 100 Years' War, which began as a feud among nobles over the crown, ended as a war between two nations, the English and the French. It was during this war that both peoples began to distinguish themselves from one another. On one hand, it became a display of national heroism, and on the other, a manifestation of particular brutality. Furthermore, the 100 Years' War heralded the end of the chivalric era, as knights began to be replaced by mercenaries, and thus these 2 centuries came to be known as the Autumn of the Middle Ages.
Interesting. I like this channel, guys. If you like this channel as well, it is called History Mapped Out. Like I said, there's going to be a link in the description section down below. There usually always is. So if there's ever a video I'm watching and you want to see the original or check out what channel the original is and see what other videos they have, you know where to find it. There's other links down there too. You guys have a super fun, awesome day, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care. Bye.